بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. The author immediately proceeds from an explanation of the components of the religion, that great edifice of Islam, Iman and Ihsan, and goes immediately onto the second pillar of Islam, which is the prayer. However, in order to enter into the prayer, one has to prepare. And the key to entrance into the prayer, which is the salah, your sila, your communion, your relationship, your connection to Allah, is tahara, is purification. And this is the topic of today's session. So the author says the obligations of wudu. Obligations here is a translation of furud, which is the plural of fard. Fard is that which the legislator, meaning the shari', the divine, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, has summoned us to do in a way which dictates obligation. Now, making that simple, there are certain things which Allah tells us to do in the Quran, but it doesn't mean it means it's a necessity or an absolute obligation. It may be a recommendation, and this is the realms of usul al-fiqh. But here we're talking about the compulsory or the obligatory components that make your wudu valid, without which the wudu is no longer sound. Now, the term wudu is challenging to translate, and oftentimes I think we'll just keep it in its original Arabic, but it's related to wada'a, which means radiance, or like a brilliance, like a spectacular beauty. So there's the concept very much early on that in order to prepare for prayer, that we're engaging in a beautification process. We're not just washing something, we're cleansing and renewing and engaging into the prayer. The obligations of wudu, ablution as is mentioned here, are 6. The first of which is mentioned here is an-niyyah, which is the Arabic for the intention. The meaning of an-niyyah, or the intention, is they say qasdu shay. It's literally that you're orienting towards something. So this is concept, once again, right at the onset of your preparing, before entering into prayer, that you are orienting yourself, reorienting, detoxing from other things and turning to God. What it means specifically is it's the active specification of what you're doing in order to differentiate it, to distinguish it from just washing normally. Somebody feels on a hot day, they just want to cool off, or they just want to take a regular shower. That's different from the ritual wudu, the designated act of worship, which allows us to enter into prayer. What defines this? It's the intention. And the place of which is the heart. And what that means, you could say often in English, to run it by your mind of what you're doing, to run it through your heart of what you're actually doing. وَتَلَفُّظْ بِهَا sunnah, and the utterance, the vocalization, the verbal speaking of it is a recommended act to do. And one of the reasons for this is because upon hearing one's own voice, it triggers and activates something within the heart that makes you concentrate, that brings you into a state of focus. However, the default understanding and the default action is situated and centered within the heart. So moving on to the second obligation, the second fard of the wudu, it's washing the face. Now, if you look at the beautiful organic flow of all of these integrals within the wudu, they're all combined and they all flow meticulously, as we'll find with the final obligation of wudu, which is to do with the order and doing things in order. But the place of the intention, we didn't discuss this in the first section. It only when we're talking, it comes into place when we're talking about the washing of the face. So upon the first point of washing the face, this is where one makes the intention to make the obligatory wudu in order to enter into prayer, and so on and so forth. So what do we mean by the face? The definition is from the top to bottom and side to side. The meaning of the top of the head is the point of the hairline. Now, if one doesn't have a hairline, it's where it would typically be or where it would have been. But the hairline here is up and including. You have to go slightly beyond in order to ensure that you've covered the entire face. You can't get it on the exact line or the exact hair. And this principle we'll find takes place throughout the remainder of the integrals of the wudu, covering above and beyond just slightly in order to ensure the nature that this has been, the obligation has well and truly been covered. So it's from the hairline up and including just the part of the hairline at the top of the forehead to up and including the dhiqn, which is the chin, this protruding bone at the bottom of one's face. And side to side is this piece of flesh which protrudes just on the closest part of the ear to the face, to that part in the other side of the face. Everything in between has to be washed over with water. Now, what's important here is there are parts of the face which sometimes want you to just splash water on the face, which is not a recommended thing to do. It's to be done gracefully. It's to be done prophetically, that you're engaging in a prophetic act, preparing once again, constantly reminding oneself to enter into the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when you do this, it's done gracefully. You cup the water and allow the water to drip over. Now this is the definition of washing. The movement of a piece of water, a drop of water from one space on the limb, being the face or the arm or the legs, as we'll get them to say, to another part of that limb. There has to be a movement. If it's not, it's considered wiping, which is a different thing. So one has to cover the entire face, ensuring that parts of perhaps just around, it's not an obligation or it's not recommended to wash the inner part of the eyeball, and these things we need to define and be very clear about. However, the inner part of the eye, often underneath the nose, where the water can often escape, it's difficult to reach, to ensure that water reaches all of these parts. This is a complete washing of the face. If a person has a thick beard, it's not to do with the length of the beard, it's an important distinguishing factor to make sure we're understanding, but it's to do with whether you can see the skin of the beard from what they call jalsat al-takhatub. And what that means, it's about 3 arms length distance from when you're speaking to someone. When you normally speak to someone, you're not going to be excessively close, you're not going to be very, very far away, but a normal distance, which they say about 3 arms length, which is roughly around 1.5 meters, give or take. Were you to be able to see the skin underneath that person's beard, that's considered a thin beard. Were you not to be able to do so, it's considered a thick beard. Now, the reason why this has a bearing upon this particular component of the obligations of wudu, if you have a thick beard, it suffices that water just drips over the front of the beard. It's sunnah and recommended to khallil, which is to put the fingers with new parts of water in the beard. However, it's not an obligation to do so in the wudu. With a thin beard, it is an obligation that water reaches the actual skin underneath the thin beard. And with this, moving on to the third integral and the third obligation of the wudu, which is washing both hands and arms, including the elbows. Now, what we're talking about here was the very tip, anything and everything, including from the very tips of the fingers, including the nails, all in between the hands, the palm, the wrist, all the way up and including the elbow, which is the protruding bone where the lower arm and the top arm, which meets the shoulder, conjoins. Now, because we can't draw or imagine the exact precise line of that conjoining of the elbow, it's an obligation for us to go once again upon this principle, covering slightly further to ensure that we have properly covered the entirety of that limb. And on this point, it's important perhaps to consider that when people do roll their sleeves up sometimes, and they're ready to they're ready to make wudu, maybe they don't have much time. This can often be something which is neglected, and they only do it up to partway through, around this area. So it's very important that it goes up and beyond the elbow, all the way up until the shoulder, which is considered sunnah and a recommended thing to do. So number 4, wiping part of the head. So we talked about washing earlier, now we're talking about wiping. Wiping is differentiated or distinguished from washing in that you run the water over the hand and you run it over the head. It doesn't require that you wash and the head becomes drained with water. So the head, what we're talking about here is the typical hairline of the scalp of a person. And the reason why this is important is because if a person were to have long hair, that it doesn't suffice that you take the end part of that long hair that goes from outside of the constraints of the scalp, of the hairline, and you wash it with water. That would not suffice. However, they say it's as little as a part of one single strand of hair would suffice, as long as it's on within the realms and the confines of the scalp. So the 5th obligation of wudu, the 5th integral, is washing both feet up and including the ankles. So we've got to be cautious. We spoke just previously about the wiping of the head and what distinguishes wiping from washing. We don't wipe the feet, we wash the feet. And similarly, as with the hands up to the elbows, you have the tips of the fingers up and including the elbow. With one's feet, you have the tips of one's toes up and including the ankle, which is to clarify that protruding bone which conjoins the lower part of the leg to the foot. It's important to ensure that depending on the season or the land in which one's lived, the dryness can affect, particularly with heels, any kind of cracks and this kind of thing, without harming oneself, to ensure that water does penetrate and water is washed over the entire limb, the entire foot. So after this, we go into the 6th and the final obligation of wudu, which references everything prior to it. The 6th obligation or integral of the wudu is doing the actions in this order. And what that means is you start with the intention, then wash the face. And obviously the intention is upon washing the first part of the face. Moving on to the washing both hands and arms up, including the elbows. Moving on to wiping a part of the head. Moving on consecutively. Washing the feet and including the ankles. Without proceeding, for example, washing one's feet over the face. Were somebody to do this would nullify the wudu and render it invalid. It would not be a sound and valid wudu. You would not be able to enter into the prayer with this wudu. So it's important to consider this. This is not something that can necessarily tangibly be seen, but you can see it in terms of the process. So you have the intention, once again, can't be seen unless a person utters it. Then you have the whole process of making wudu. And the 6th and the final obligation, once again, is to do this in this particular order, in this particular routine. And with this, we complete the obligations of wudu. So to clarify, the obligations of wudu are 6 integrals. The intention, washing the face, washing both hands, up and the arms up and including the elbows, wiping a part of the head, washing both feet up and including the ankles, and to do this in this exact order. So this is the first taster, the first template, if you like, of which can be built on in our path of sacred knowledge, learning how the Prophet ﷺ would prepare for prayer. And through this, we ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows us to enter into the prayer fully prepared, with presence of heart, with performing the wudu in a beautiful manner, in a prophetic manner, in a still manner. And this is why some of the scholars have said that where we want to attain a presence within the prayer, then call presence to one's heart. Be mindful whilst in the wudu. And this has an effect which impacts the prayer. If we're not mindful, if we're not performing it first and foremost correctly in terms of the obligations of wudu, and we're not mindful that this is a preparatory act to enter into the presence of Allah, to worship Allah, an act of devotion, an act of love. The more mindful that we are of this, the more we cultivate this within our minds and our hearts, the more that we'll be able to gain more and experience more from the realities of the prayer, our connection back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May Allah grant us this. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil.